Dave, you got a sign-up sheet. Thank you everyone for coming. There's a sign-up sheet up at the front here if anyone wishes to speak. We will convene our third meeting today on our special study committee on property tax. Today's discussion, as we had talked about at the last meeting, was really just have more of a discussion within the committee about the information we've heard, and any thoughts that you may have relevant to some reform to our property tax assessment process or the appeal process or both. So I know some members of the committee have not been able to make all the meetings, so that's understandable. But to the extent that we can, what I thought we would do is just talk about things that you heard from the Department of Revenue in terms of that process, or other members that have spoken or given us information that you may have some thoughts on in terms of those two subject areas, and any reforms or suggestions you may have. With that, what I'll do is just kind of start off myself. In listening to DOR's presentation of the assessment process, and this may be more of a county by county approach, but I was not aware that within each assessor's office they create these neighborhoods of similarly situated building structures, and that data could be available to the taxpayer. And the reason why it seemed important to me is that for a taxpayer to say whether or not you're being considered on a mass appraisal and you're being placed into a category of similarly situated homes, if it's a residential or commercial, obviously different. But the availability of that information, what makes up that particular group or neighborhood of homes, why were they placed into that neighborhood or homes, what were the similar characteristics. That data is objective in a sense. So you can know the square footage, the heated square footage of a home or a building. You can know what amenities are there. You can know whether basements are involved, so those things are knowable and they're objective. They're measurable. But the choice of how to pull them together, the characterization of whether that house is in good or fair condition, those have a level of subjectivity. I mean, I don't know if you remember seeing some of the images that Ellen presented to us, where she had a PowerPoint and slideshow of different homes, and the gentleman characterized them as either fair or good condition or excellent condition, and not dissimilar from what you do when you're doing a Kelley Blue Book search for your car and you want to characterize the vehicle. That's subjective. So there's an element of subjectivity in what makes up those neighborhoods, it appeared to me. Having access to that information and understanding how your property was classified within a certain neighborhood and what makes up that neighborhood seemed to be something that was new to me, was not, and was and there seemed to be a lack of transparency relative to that subject area. And the reason why it was important to me was that it set the mass value of your property. So if you can understand why you've been placed in that grouping, it may help the taxpayer know that, yeah, this is a fair and reasonable assessment based upon that grouping. But you could have situations where you have a property that is within the same literal subdivision, but yet the house is placed in a different neighborhood. And I'm trying to use the terminology of subdivision as to what you would think about a community that is actually land subdivided into parcels. But depending on the nature of the home, it might be placed into a different neighborhood of other homes. It could be placed in a neighborhood of homes that have basements, and yet a percentage of those homes within the subdivision don't have basements, so they get classified into different neighborhoods for taxation purposes. So knowing that information would seem to be I thought a transparency element to our deliberations was for the taxpayer to understand what neighborhood he or she's been classified in, or his property's been classified in. So I'll just start with that in terms of the assessment. That was something that I thought would be better suited if it was more transparent to the taxpayer. Any thoughts from other members of the committee? Pat, what number is that? One. Well, witness one. Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'm glad you brought that up because as I look over my notes, that's one of the things that was pretty new information to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like
I also noticed that the assessment process, or the check on that assessment process, was lacking in my summation. DOR's ability to test on a 3-year period, and then if DOR found a deviation in that process, and found that there was an error, if you will, in the assessment, in the mass appraisal assessment for the county, triggered essentially a warning. And then 3 more years could pass before another reevaluation would occur, or another double check, if you will, by DOR on that county's appraisal process. And sanctions would only be put in place if the same error were made twice within now what would be a 6-year period. And that concerns me from 2 perspectives. One is the taxpayers themselves have no input really into the assessment process other than what they return as their value. So you can sign off on a return as to what you think the value of your property is, and that goes to the assessor's office for consideration. The other aspect is to appeal it, challenge it. Other than that, all this is done internally, and it's data driven. But if there is derivations in this very complicated system, DOR is in the best position to check that. And if DOR is only checking it on a 3-year basis, then the taxpayers may not be placed in the right neighborhood. There may be flaws in how the neighborhood is formed. The neighborhood may be diluted over time with a lot of appeals. So if you're in a neighborhood whereby 10% or more of the property owners are appealing, then they're locking in their rates at a lower rate, and thus the neighborhood may be similar in context, but it's not similar in value. The value isn't uniform within that neighborhood because many have appealed and had their rates locked in at a lower rate than perhaps yours. So the check on that seemed too long to me, that period of time, the 3-year and the 6-year period. So I had some concerns about that, and the oversight the DOR may have relative to that. And I'm not saying, and maybe it's even worth considering, whether DOR should be in that business of double checking, or that should be a different Department of Audits, perhaps. Because the Department of Audits, we learned, does do a review. They do a sales ratio study to determine whether or not every county has completed a sales ratio study that's consistent with what they project the market is for that county. If that sales ratio study shows that there's a deviation beyond the permitted range, then that can adversely impact school board assessments and also transportation facilities within that county. So there seemed to be very little, I guess, supervision or very little statewide checks and balances on the local assessment process, and so that concerned me. Any other thoughts or comments on that? Matt?
there was another couple of issues that I spent a lot of time reading
clerk, is it in here? Okay, there was, we did have I thought the Superior Court clerks had given us an email, relative to the number of cases that they surveyed.
I can definitely provide.
Okay, see if you can check that. Pat, about we asked the Superior Court clerks to go and survey as many counties as they could. They checked with 81 counties to determine last year what the number of appeals to Superior Court, what that number was. And I believe they sent Brian Groom an email that contains some of that information. So I'll forward that on to you in terms of the number of Superior Court cases.
So the Superior Court had a different opinion there.
Well, the clerks, the numbers, I just need to give you the numbers. I don't remember what those numbers were relative to, as it was, whether it was a significant number or not, I couldn't tell you.
But they didn't have a specific recommendation.
No, I mean, the Council Superior Court clerks didn't make any recommendations. They just gave us a good bit of data at the last meeting regarding the appeals. So, for example, they had talked about that in general, if you looked at your smallest counties, it was still costing them about $240,000 per year to handle the appeals that they were seeing. So when you, which would seem to, fairly expensive. So we have kind of a flat line, a baseline, if you will, of the cost to handle those appeals. And then for higher, obviously for larger counties, that cost could get as high as $2.1 million. So, it's fairly significant. And for that data that they provided, that was about, I think, 51% reporting. Maybe a little bit more than that, maybe 60% reporting in terms of number of counties. But if you work that out, I was trying to figure out the number and say that if the total cost for that 60% reporting was $2.8 million is what they told us in terms of the cost of appeals. So the BOEs, their per diem, hearing officers per diem, the training, all that goes with it, the administration of all that, looked to be costing statewide for that 60% of those reporting counties was about $2.8 million.
This was cost of the county.
Mm-hmm.
For information that had always been collected by the Texas Reservoir.
This is a cost to administer the appeal process at the local level. So that was interesting. That's 60%. Then you're looking at about $5 million in terms of statewide cost if you just assume that that the rest of the state counties that we're not reporting are on par. So it's fairly significant in terms of the cost of just administrating the local appeal process. But as to the Superior Court, the burden on the Superior Court, they don't have those numbers. They had sent those to me, but I don't have them with me today. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mr. Dempsey, yes, sir. Go ahead.
This has been quite an education for me, and I wonder, is there an educational process for the public? Has one been anticipated so that property owners might be invited to a seminar and understand the process better? I've never heard of that being a part of the process, and it might invite more controversy or appeals than otherwise, but I wonder if that should be thought about, because this is quite a different appraisal process that we heard about than a standard appraisal process that I'm familiar with a licensed appraiser in the market.
So the licensed appraiser in the market, just explain for folks a little bit more what a licensed appraiser would do in the marketplace by comparison to that mass appraisal system that's being used.
Well, they're in the market, you're going to have a very specific set of standards that you'll go by, and there will be a personal inspection by an appraiser of either residential, commercial, or industrial property. And I think there will be the comparable sales ideas about the same, but the inspection of the property is where it would differ. It'd be a much more detailed inspection of the property itself, because you're looking at an income approach and a cost approach and a replacement approach. So you've got three different kinds of ways of looking at a piece of property. It's just a much more detailed, specific, property-specific process than it would be with a mass appraisal idea.
And I think that, Mr. Commissioner, I think that what they will do is that, and this is a generalized statement, but I think that when someone challenges their property value is when the current process is now supposed to trigger a more exacting review of the property. Now, whether that occurs or not is probably difficult to say. I mean, I would suspect it probably doesn't happen with great frequency other than a drive-by viewing, just because of the number of appeals that might be filed and the limited number of resources and personnel to go and do that. But it does go to the question of, to what extent are you getting a market value versus a more subjective valuation. And then to your point about educational seminars, I don't know of any, and I don't know that we've heard any. And unless the DOR has some of these slideshows on their website, which they may, I don't know of any public educational seminars that that you could go and review. But it's interesting because you could do one and put it online, and that would be available for anybody to watch if they wanted to watch at their convenience.
It just occurs to me that the only education many homeowners or property owners get in this process is if they do appeal. And then they...
By experience.
By experience. And then they find out much more about what's going on. It could, with that kind of education, it could help the process more than hurt it.
It might eliminate some questions or answer questions
Exactly.
that the property taxpayer has without having to go through the process of learning sort of the hard way, I guess.
Exactly.
So I'm just making notes on a couple of these as you have these ideas or suggestions. I'm just going to make some notes on those to see what we follow up with on that. The appeal process also seemed to me to be expensive. There was some discussion about the effectiveness of boards of equalization, and it's not clear to me how effective they may be in reviewing and reconsidering the property owner's perspective as to the value of the property assessed. And so I understand that they do receive training, and that many counties do feel like that there's a degree of qualifications that are met by boards of equalization. So to me, there is a question in my mind about how effective that may be from the taxpayer's perspective, because having both personal experience with it and then anecdotal experience with the process, boards of equalization will seem to defer to the assessor's office. There's a one-on-one relationship. There's an inherent interdependency, if you will, between the assessor's office and a board of equalization. You're meeting with the same individuals on a regular basis, especially in smaller counties. And that concerns me. It feels like there's not a fair separation, if you will, between the Board of Equalization as a neutral and versus just inherently by human nature, not intentionally, but just by human nature, becoming reliant on what the assessor's office is telling the Board of Equalization. And if the information isn't readily available to the public in a way that can be found, so if you can't find that neighborhood information, or you can't dig into why your property's been lumped in with another set of properties, then you don't know what pool you're comparing to. It's relatively easy for for property owners to go on to Q Public and look up a property and look up another one that has sold within the last year, for example. But whether that property is in the same neighborhood, I haven't been able to determine that. And so you might, as a property owner, you might go and pull various homes that you think are comparable. And while they may be comparable in your eyes, they may not be comparable in the assessor's office eyes, because those properties may not be a part of that same neighborhood. And if the neighborhood is how it's mass appraised, then you're not really talking apples and apples. You're talking apples and oranges. And in which case, you really aren't having a conversation with the assessor about why your property is assessed the way it is. You're just being told, well, we don't consider that comparable. But there has to be a discussion of what do you consider comparable. And then where's the data by which the property owner can see that without having to hire a lawyer or to hire a specialist or a consultant. It seems like that should be more available than maybe it is, and maybe it is available, but it's just challenging to find. Could be just me, but I have had some difficulty finding that kind of information. Another interesting thing is that in the assessment process, DOR only has the ability to check the wind-shaped files, the assessment files, when invited. So there is no way for DOR, the Department of Audits, or whoever, or a state agency, to look into and look behind the curtain, so to speak, and see what the Wizard of Oz is up to without gaining permission. And so that concerned me. And then you'd have to ask for that permission, and then it seems like it's only on a 3-year cycle that you're going to get permission to look. And as Pat was saying earlier, that you have places that may be growing faster, accelerating in terms of the market sales. And so if your reassessment or revaluation of that particular area or that neighborhood isn't more regular than 3 years, then you're essentially falling behind what the market is. And that's detrimental to the government in the sense that they're not collecting the revenues that they should be collecting. And if you're not collecting the revenues that you ought to be collecting, then that means that other folks are carrying the burden for that under-assessed properties or neighborhood. So there does seem to be some concern with the frequency of it. I'm not suggesting I have any solutions. I'm just pointing out what I heard that gave me pause in terms of the testimony from DOR. Any other comments or thoughts?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I missed the last meeting, so
Yes.
I'm catching up a little bit. Y'all being here in special session, primarily precipitated by the horrible natural disaster that hit South Georgia, the hurricane and so forth, brings to mind the status of those properties in those areas that have school systems as of January 1st are going to be just worth nothing. But kids still have to go to school and all this
Yeah, if you're in Bleakley, Georgia, or, yeah, yeah, no, sir.
Three children are still going to school there, and they've, been going back because the schools were built and they didn't get blown down, so what do you do? I don't know. When you're just strictly to this quantitative value think, that the whole system, undergird, I don't know that we have plan B. So it should be another qualitative consideration maybe for the committee.
3 years from now, they'll do an assessment.
You said what you think, that's it. I'm done thinking.
No, it's good. It's a good point. So the mic is not working, so I'm just going to repeat what was said by the judge, and Judge, tell me if I misstate this. But the question he's raising is, what do you do in a situation where you have such a large, devastating disaster that effectively potentially wipes out the property values within a large geographic area, entire counties, adversely impacted by a hurricane of this magnitude. When the property taxes serve as the primary funding sources for your school systems, as well as with county and local governments, and you go through an assessment that next year, when January 1 rolls around for 2019, what is the marketplace going to look like? What is the ad valorem value for property at that point in time on January 1, 2019, given the amount of destruction that has occurred? And that's a good question. We have not looked at what that answer is, because at the same time you have the competing concept of government revenue suffering, and then not being able to provide services that are essential to the taxpayer on the other side, saying, my property is worth nothing, why should I pay taxes on something that's not of value? So you have those two competing, which are working at the antithesis of each other in that situation, in a horrible, tragic situation that we have seen in Southwest Georgia. Is that fair? And
I have the answers to these questions.
yes, no, and that's what we're doing. Is I want us to ask those questions. I wanted us to take the information we've gotten and ask the questions so that we can take notes. And if members of the public, if you have information, or you've seen, or you have answers, or you have comments that you want to make, please do so, because that's why we have a sign-in sheet and mics for you to comment on. So if you're hearing a question, or you heard or thought you heard something that was interesting to you before or problematic, then please let us know what those are. I think we invited everyone to send in emails and comments based upon the hearings that we've taken thus far. We've had 2 lengthy, 2.5-hour long hearings, that maybe a little longer, leading up to this one. So, and to be quite candid, we got very little in terms of response by members of the public or interested parties as to comments. We have one memo that we did receive, and it is appreciated. So there are numerous suggestions that we received, and we'll send that out to the committee that I just got as I walked in. And you should have a hard copy here, from the Georgia Association of Property Tax Professionals. And so you'll see a list of suggestions from that organization. So those are things that we need to consider. And as you ask these questions, I don't have a solution to any of those things, but that's why we're meeting, is to study this and try to come up with the questions and see if we can't discern the answers. Perhaps Florida has some solutions, statutory or regulatory solutions that address situations just like this. And so with that suggestion, Judge, I think we'll do a little investigation on that. And that may require us to do a lot more investigation over the next couple of months leading into session. It occurred to me as to whether or not there was a value in having trained professionals, such as hearing officers, actually perform these hearings as opposed to boards of equalization. What if you had folks that had to be certified and trained, and this is what they did on a regular basis, and perhaps rotated throughout the state so that you didn't have an exorbitant number of individuals, but a team, if they were out of the Department of Audits or the Department of Revenue, that's what they were trained to do. And effectively, that was another level of check because they would not be paid for by local government. They wouldn't have per diem paid for from the local assessment process. They're rotating, so they're not also building up that inherent human relationship that does develop, and that they are trained. They're looking at. They have a level of training and sophistication, certified appraisers in the state of Georgia that may be able to provide more discerning questions, and also have the power to look into the system so that they could look into the assessment system, the wind gap system of that county, and analyze the appeal that's made by a taxpayer. That had occurred to me, but that would require a shift in terms of revenue to pay for that. But would that be helpful to the taxpayers in assuring as a check, if you will, on the assessment process? So that you would file your appeal, it would go before a hearing officer, and then the hearing officer could decide the issue. We've changed the laws historically so that the burden is on the assessor's office to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that their assessment is valid and meets the criteria of the state law. But if I think about the average person going into those hearings, I don't think the average person knows how to counter that, knows how to ask the right questions. And so by having a professional that does this, that isn't paid for by the local government, isn't hired by the local government, isn't selected locally, that person may be in a better position to ask the questions that need to be asked to double check the assessment process and what the assessors have done. That was something that occurred to me as Ellen was going through her presentation on the appeal process. I'm going to look through this list here just so that other folks in the audience can. One of the suggestions from the association was to require counties to reappraise every real parcel in the county at least once every 3 years. That is one suggestion here. It's a lengthy suggestion, but that's how it begins. Another one would be considering an additional charge where you might phase in the appraisal process. I'll have to read through that one in more detail. And the other one was that actually, here's a suggestion. It says committee should consider adding a hearing officer. This is number 3. Hearing officer division for all real property, residential property, and charge a fee for the hearing officers. These being what? No, I was thinking of having them as state employees. Revenue or maybe the Department of Audits. Yeah. In that way, you're having an entity that is whose job is solely as a double check. That's the purpose.
So the goal is to make sure that the assessments are more accurate and equitable across the neighborhoods. Would that enhance the quality of the assessments in the counties? I mean, is that
I was thinking of just how to create a sense of fairness within that process, and also ensuring that there is a check on the assessment process that can be fairly heard by a neutral that's qualified to do so. So that all I was thinking was providing a process that provides like I said, a more neutral check on the assessment process. I was thinking that only because of the cost associated with the boards of equalization, trying to reroute that cost, essentially shifting the cost to the state. So it would not be a gain. We have to figure out how do you recoup or capture that money in order to pay for the hearing officers. But that's a much more complex analysis that I had gotten to. I was looking at big picture. In a big picture. And the other thing is that it does when we engage in typically with local governmental issues, you want a litigant to what we call exhaust all your administrative remedies. So if you have local remedies such as going to a hearing officer and being heard, you want that to be meaningful. And right now the way it works is that if you don't like the judgment given to you by a board of equalization or a hearing officer or that arbitration panel that could be used, if you don't like that, then you can appeal to Superior Court and you get a de novo or a full hearing again. So a whole nother shot at relitigating the issue one more time in Superior Court before a jury, and that has some value, if you will, if you wish to have it before a jury of your peers, because they may be sympathetic to you, and so that may be an advantage to taxpayers to have a sympathetic jury that doesn't like paying taxes, property taxes, evaluating your case. The flip side of that is that for everyone that gets a reduction in their property taxes, someone else is picking that up, right? So it's like squeezing a balloon. You squeeze it on one end, it's going to bulge at the other end. So, I don't know that that's a good thing or bad thing, but it does allow for that process, and that does give you a second bite. But what if the process was that you had to go through that hearing process, and then if you wanted to go to the Superior Court and appeal it, would it just be a review of the record, which is an alternative? So you just review the record. Did everybody analyze the data, and was there enough information to support the assessor's findings? If that's almost a yes or no question, a judge can make that determination fairly easily, and that would reduce the litigation cost associated to the local government. Now, whether that's fair to the taxpayer or not, is a different question, but important to that system. Greg, did you have a comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, I'd like to respond.
Sure. I think grab that mic that's the cord, or come. We'll come over here, grab this one here, and just sit with us over this way, because I don't think that.
I don't think the witness mics are working today.
Yeah. So we'll go with 3.
Oh.
Okay, good.
Stuart Oliver, Gwinnett County Chief Appraiser. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for the committee for taking up a matter that I know to me is extremely important, and to other members in the room is a very important matter, which is the fairness to taxpayers. It's something we're charged to uphold every day, is fairness. And I'm moved by the thoughts on your mind about these people that have gone through disasters. I was moved to say something because what I've picked up on in here is there's obviously a concern about the general. When we say taxpayers, most of us comes to mind is we think about the individual. In my county, in Gwinnett, 95% of the properties that we have are residential folks that are, in our communities, and those are the people that come to our mind. We don't often necessarily think about the commercial end of that and how much we rely on commercial properties. Unfortunately, what also gets left out when we're talking about appeals is we don't understand necessarily, when we talk about the shifting of the burden, we don't really understand how much burden is shifted over to the individual taxpayer because of their lack of access to the same benefits that commercial property owners have. So I just want to make sure everybody understands, and my motivation is just to make sure that everything's kind of is clear. There's some limitations on, while we've talked about the audit program and how it can be improved, there's some lacks in the current audit program as it exists by the Department of Audits and Accountancy. And that is, for example, when we're audited in my county or any county, every year there is an audit that goes on. And it is more stringent every 3 years. But that audit, the sample of data, it throws out anything that has been frozen in value by 299C. So you're getting a very tainted view of what the level of fairness is in the county. So what that means is, let me point to share some numbers with you. In Gwinnett County is just an example. I can only speak for my county. For every notice of assessment that goes out, it has a new value. Only 4% of my residential people are going to appeal. Compare that to, for every notice I send out for commercial, 80% of those people will appeal. There's obviously a motivation. Now, it could be that people are more educated. It could be that they're targeted by representatives who want to provide a service. And it could be simply the motivation of there's more payoff from having your value frozen in time for 1 or multiple years. It'd be speculation on my part to figure out which of those is driving it. It's probably a mixture of all three. But what that also means is that in any given year, by the effect of things lasting for building on each other, my residential digest, about 12 to 15% of it is frozen at a different state and time each year, a lower value. While say 30 to 40% of my commercial and industrial digest is frozen in a different state and time. Therefore, when this all boils out down to an actual tax bill, they're paying on a different actual tax rate than the taxpayer. They may all see the same tax rate, but if you combine the actual value after all the calculations are done, clearly there's an effective tax rate.
Stuart, you're talking about it whereby someone has appealed it, had a change in their valuation.
Correct.
And that valuation is then frozen for the current year, or the year of the assessment, as well as the following 2 years.
Correct.
So that property could be 3 years behind the market assessment, whether it went up or down.
Correct. And so the amount of, because of this, like I said, 40% of the commercial industrial digest being now frozen at an older date and time compared to the residential digest, you're seeing that's where the burden you have being shifted. It's not from one, it's not really the neighbor to the other neighbor. Yeah, that happens. But I think if there was a way, when I talk about the way the audits are done, the fact that all of the properties that are frozen at time, so it had a sale, so somebody would say, well, if a property's sold, we want to see how the county's value compared to that sales price. Well, unfortunately, we can't because it hasn't been updated for 2 to 3 years, so it wouldn't be fair to judge the county on that. So you pull those all out of the study. In the end, you end up with a study that makes everybody look, it looks like we're doing a great job because, I mean, of all the property values that I can touch, that my staff can adjust, we do. Residential, commercial, do everything we can to keep everybody fair and just. But there's a whole lot of other properties that are being untouched. And it doesn't allow, and the way the audit system is set up is it doesn't allow anybody to really understand how much that burden you're concerned, I think rightfully concerned about that burden being shifted from one person to somebody else. And oftentimes to the person less able to cover that burden. The ability to measure it right now is lacking because of the lacks in the audit program. And so, I just want to point that out. I think how you get down to these numbers, and again, I unfortunately also am one who sometimes just has lots of questions and not a solution. I just want to make sure that everybody's aware, though, that there is a real reason to be concerned about those least able to cover their to handle this burden, and to really understand where that shifting is coming from. At least in my county, is the only one I can speak to. But at any time I can be of any assistance in sharing more data with you, I'd be happy to.
Okay. That's great. Questions for Stuart?
All right, thank you.
Thank you. That's helpful. Then there was I remember the association had made a comment at the last meeting that they they thought that there needed to be more information available and then a way for the taxpayers to review their assessments before they filed an appeal, because the way the system's set up is you get your notice, you have 45 days to appeal. And it's just not a lot of time to evaluate. So then go into, to Commissioner, your point about having some level of education where you can go and say, okay, now I understand how this was done or how this assessment was done, at least in theory. And then I know to what extent that questions I might be needing to ask. But because of the way we're set up with our current system, you have to file that appeal. The Board of Assessors has an opportunity to reevaluate automatically, to look at it. Once that appeals notice is filed, they can do it. If they come back and alter it, then you have to decide again as the property owner whether you're going to appeal that. So let's say, for example, the Board of Assessors drops your property value by 10%, the assessed value by 10%. You still think that's off. You have to initiate an appeal again for a BOE hearing or a hearing officer hearing, or you could do the arbitration panel. But in all of those scenarios, you still have to know the next step, and you have to initiate that next step. And there's not a lot of time for the information to be exchanged. Now, once you do trigger that appeal, then there's supposed to be a back and forth exchange of information as to what you think your property is worth and why, and then that same information should be given to you from the tax assessor's office prior to the hearing. But I think it's a short window before the hearing.
That's the biggest complaint I have. People don't have time to do it.
And then if you miss your hearing, I think you get one opportunity more after that, but I have to go into check my notes on that. So that was a comment the association had made. Also, another comment that was made here is that there was the committee should consider eliminating the 85% temporary payment under appeal because it creates a level of confusion. There's another one about interest caps being eliminated. And then there's more comments about transparency. Those are the notes that I had, or the comments I had, or thoughts that I had through the process. I don't know if you had others, but I don't want to waste. I don't want us to spin wheels here. I think maybe there's some more information that I need to gain and pull together for you that addresses these hurricane situations or a devastating event situation. Also look at DOR and see if they do have some online public resources for educational purposes. I'll get you the information the clerk sent to us just recently on the Superior Court clerks, and how that impacts the Superior Courts themselves. And then it sounds like we'll have to have some more discussion with on this burden shifting issue, because it does concern me that you lock in those appraised values for a period of time, which I think is helpful to the taxpayer. But what it means is that there is a percentage group of the public that is behind. So, for example, if you have a neighborhood that consists of 100 homes, and that neighborhood they've been determined to be similar, and 10% of the neighborhood appeals, so you have 10 people that appeal, and they all come out with a lower value on their assessed property values and as a result of their appeals. To what extent is that number, that reduction, factored into the next assessment? Because if all of them were wrong, or found to be wrong, then why would the neighborhood not also be adjusted likewise? The entire group. If they were all found to be undervalued and should have been increased, why wouldn't the neighborhood likewise all be increased? So But what you see is that you have individuals that appeal and lock in that value, and they have that benefit for 3 years, while as the rest of the group of those similarly situated properties don't receive that benefit. And you get this imbalance, if you will. I think it's a lack of uniformity between and among that group. Maybe someone has some comments on that issue.
Getting some comment.
Yeah, I think so. Ma'am, go ahead.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the committee. I'm James Stokes. I'm the chief appraiser with Paulding County. I'm also the president-elect for the Georgia Association of Assessing Officials.
Okay.
I do apologize. You had asked last week that we provide the committee with a listing of possible issues as well as some recommendation for correction. We did send out, we emailed the committee. I believe it might have been your secretary. I don't know.
Okay.
I do have copies available
All right, good.
for the committee.
Sure. Well, it's a different one. Yeah, there we go. Go ahead. Yeah, thank you for being here, and thank you for providing this white paper.
Okay. I did want to give you a little background on me. I've been a certified fee appraiser for over 25 years.
What level?
Certified residential fee appraiser. I'm also classified as an appraiser 4 with the Georgia Department of Revenue. So I'm familiar with the fee side as well as the mass appraisal side. And to be honest with you, the differences between the two are limited. A fee appraiser does do an inspection, just as a regular appraiser on the ad valorem side would. They're looking at more of a blend rather than the specifics. Going back between the fee side and the ad valorem side, I would have to say from my experience that the ad valorem side is a lot more difficult, as you're appraising way more properties and considering uniformity without the consideration that the fee appraiser does. And where I'm going with that is, in Paulding County, we're issuing about 67,000 notices every year. We have to defend each and every one of those notices. We're spending the 45-day appeal period and 365 days a year explaining to our taxpayers in our local counties what's going on in our local markets. The young lady right here, she was talking about the neighborhoods. Boards of assessors don't determine the neighborhoods. Boards of assessors reflect what the market is doing. A neighborhood can be as simple as a elementary school district, middle, high school. It can be a county. It can be a specific type of property. It can be segments within a specific residential subdivision. It's all what the market is doing, and those can change going from market period to market period. So that's where the neighborhood situation really comes from, and it's all reflected in your values that we're producing each and every year. The comments have been made about the public information availability. We struggle with this. We do struggle with this. In Paulding County, we have recently subscribed with, you had mentioned QPublic. It is an excellent website. However, there is a substantial cost to local taxpayers for having these type things. We look to have analytics added to it, but the more detailed analytics you have, those seem to limit themselves to individual homeowners. Just simply with trying to make these products available in a means that they can understand. That's what we really seem to struggle with, is to have these people understand exactly how that process works. If there's anything at all from this committee as far as tax assessment, we're always available at any time to explain any specific situation. the white paper drafted, it was specific to property limitations. Mr. Oliver makes a valid point. The Department of Audits and Accounts, the effects of property limitations aren't reflected in those studies. Each year, I provide our Board of Commissioners and our school system with the impact of property limitations. This is not, well, this is in addition to the limitations that I'm trying to not necessarily justify to a property owner when they're looking at their neighbor's value being X and his value being something different, and then explaining, well, that's what the law says. He appealed 3 years ago, now his value is set. Last year, under the limitations in value under the appeal locks, there was over $120,000 tax shift to everybody. And Paulding County is not a very big county. The shift in tax from sales price cap was right at $300,000 in Paulding County. So those are valid changes that are causing a shift in properties and creating differences in assessments, which frankly aren't reflected in any market segment. So I'd be glad to answer any questions that you have or attempt.
So does the 3-year lock-in, does that encourage, does it make it harder for the assessor to revalue the property, in the sense that going into that appeal process, that if you lose the appeal or there's a reduction, that it is locked in for 3 years? How does that affect the motivations of the assessor, knowing that that's there?
There is no motivation. Assessors have no motivation one way or another other than the fairness to all property owners and to create a value that's relative to what's going on for that respective market. When a property owner appeals, it doesn't have to be a value reduction. All they have to do is show up and provide some kind of documentary evidence that supports an opinion, and by default, that value is locked. All right, it's locked unless there are substantial changes made to a property, things like that would cause a property to remove. Or if a property owner simply does not like that value, they can return and value something differently, and that lock would be removed.
What about, and this is a general question for everybody, but there was some discussion early on about the timing of our bills, that when they go out and when they're due, is based upon our agrarian history, that payments for property taxes would come in when the crops came in. So is there, just thinking to the taxpayers, is there an advantage that tax payments are spread out, that they are that payments can be made over the course of the year as opposed to all at one time? Is that any value, or does that create a different problem?
Now, this is really outside of the scope of the assessor's office. However, from my comments from thousands of property owners, the property tax is a single payment, is a single large check if you do not have those escrowed.
Right.
And at the time of the year, it is problematic for people given you're into the holiday season. Paulding County's deadline is November 15th. A lot of counties are in December. Some counties do have split billing, things of that nature. How that would affect counties' revenues, things like that, I really couldn't. That would change. That would be a huge change in the whole system.
And I guess, and I don't know in the code whether or not there is a specified deadline for payment other than what may be set by the local government. I don't know if there is, because if you've got split billing, then I assume that means that locally you can set up a different billing process or different scheduled billing than just November, or it's typically when I'm writing my check is October, November. So
That would be my assumption.
and maybe Clint with ACCG, you may know. Do you know if there's, Clint, if there's anything that prohibits the county from doing split billing or a different billing cycle than what is typically done, other than the fact that it has to be assessed at January 1 of every year?
they're on a single bill or a split bill, is to allow them to do more than that. However, I don't know that anybody is taking advantage of that. I think there's some practical limitations in doing that. Obviously, getting the digest approved by the Department of Revenue before you can go out and do your billing. And so you'd have to get that approved earlier. And again, there's practical limitations on how early you can get that approved, to get through all these steps.
Yeah.
I know that there are other states that we have looked at that do allow some sort of a pre-billing where it's based on last year, you pre-bill a certain amount, and then once you establish the actual amount for that year, the remaining month is the difference. That would spread it out a little bit more throughout the entire year. Establish some sort of a system like that. I think most people, with all the other bills that they pay in their lives, they're used to sort of paying a little bit every month, not a big lump sum at one time during the year. For most people, it's easier for them to manage that versus having to save up money unless they're escrowing, and then that's in effect, that's what's being done.
That's right. What about regional assessments? The statute that was amended several years ago allows for regional assessment as opposed to each county doing it, which in of itself creates an administrative cost. But in smaller counties, do we know if there's anyone or any group of counties that's come together to form a regional assessment that where you have similar situated kind of properties in the area, and then they neighborhood, county and neighborhoods, yeah. Does anyone know if that's been done? No.
I'm not aware of anybody that's actually set up a regional type of assessment system. I do know that there's small counties that are sharing some
Yeah,
staff.
Clint, can you come up? Dave's right. They can't. Folks can't hear you. Yeah, we need to hear from the experts. You'll have to come around and grab one of the other mics. Either 4 or 5 right here. You can grab Clint. Yeah, the 3 is fine. Yeah.
So I know with both the Board of Equalization and with not the Board of Assessors, but the assessment staff, there was provisions made in the law that both of those could be done on a regional basis. And I'm not familiar with anybody that has set up regional boards of equalization or regional assessment staff. I do know that there's some smaller jurisdictions that, in a sense, are sharing they contract out, in other words, like with staff that maybe works in multiple counties. Like I know that there's I think a chief appraiser that has worked in multiple counties. There's some questions, I think, by the Department of Revenue. I don't want to put words in their mouth about the legality of doing that, because I think every county's supposed to have a full-time person in that position, and that would mean if they're doing it for multiple counties, then they're not full-time, they're part-time. But so there's been a little bit of that, but no true regionalization.
Is there a problem? What's the policy problem with allowing counties to contract out and not have a full-time assessor if it's a small county? Because that seems like that might be a savings to the county.
Yes, and I have to go back and look. James, you could probably answer this better, but I think in state law, it based on the number of parcels you have in your county, it basically sets a minimum staffing level, and so I think you got to have at least one person that has reached whatever level of certification in every county, a full-time person. But we've got some counties that, again, they don't have would not have any full-time people, right? They would contract out, and so they would not have anybody full-time on staff.
And I guess you have to have some level of staffing, because you're looking at sales, and you have to check the title records to see what sales. You're checking the PT 61 forms to see what people would pay in terms of their property taxes on a sale, transfer of property, and then you may need to be doing some site inspections if there's an improvement. Someone adds on to the house or to the commercial establishment, and improves it. It was vacant at one point, now they've improved it. And those would all trigger a need to re-review that property. So that that does lend in terms of a policy perspective towards having some minimum level of staff. What about on the periodic timetable by which the a segment of the property, all commercial property, should be reevaluated? I don't recall in the law there's any statutory requirement that be done on a periodic basis. It seems like what I've heard is good practice to try to do that every 3 to 5 years. In some cases, it doesn't get done for 10 years. So I've kind of heard it all over, varying all over the place. But of what value and what detriment would that be to require a reevaluation of the entire digest or segments of the digest on a periodic basis? Number one. Number two, to what extent would contracting out that service be of value to counties?
So you're correct. There's nothing that requires that our assessors value property every so often. The Constitution of Georgia says it's supposed to be at fair market value, but the reality is it may or may not be, and you can look at the sales ratio study as an indicator of if you are sort of within that range or not. The other thing to consider is if you were to require some sort of appraisal of all properties within a certain time frame, what type of appraisal? Because my understanding, and again, James would be a better one to answer this, is there's sort of a computer-generated type appraisal where they don't actually go out and take a tape measure and measure, the property and look to see if there's a new basement that's been finished or a new dwelling on the property. So that's a more intensive level of appraisal where you actually send somebody out physically out there to inspect the property and take measurements, which is obviously more costly than doing something on the computer where you're sort of comparing sales in the area. You're sort of adjusting everything based on a computer model, which I think is more typical of what they do more on a regular basis. So I think when you hear these stories about they've not valued it potentially in a 10-year period, I think those are usually where they haven't actually sent somebody out to do that. And I know that a lot of counties are contracting that work out, I believe, now. So if they, for the actual sending somebody out to do those site inspections, it's very, very common for them to outsource that to companies that do that type of work. In fact, I know in Cobb County they do that. And I think that's pretty prevalent in a lot of counties.
So it seems that what we were told at the meeting before last was that there's a wind gap system that's typically used by most of the counties, not all of them, but I think some of the metro counties, maybe Gwinnett, Fulton has a different system, but it goes to your point, Clint, that it's a computer-based modeling system, and that's where we got this concept of neighborhoods built around that system. And the way they explained it to us was that they go in and essentially reconstruct, if you will, or deconstruct the building. So if residential or commercial, deconstruct it within it, taking its elements and putting that into this computer model. Square footage, heating square footage, accessory structures, etc., size of the rooms, the nature of the building, the size of the lot, etc., and then grading it also subjectively as to whether or not they think it's in good condition, fair condition, poor condition, and then that information kind of forms the baseline, if you will, for the computer system. And then from that point, which really to me is a cost to reconstruct approach, because you're looking at the cost of construction of the structure, and then that may be offset or adjusted based upon the sales of similarly situated buildings, or and mostly with commercial, maybe an income approach is applied to it to see what kind of rental rates it's getting. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of how it was explained to us, and that's why we referring to this wind gap system or the neighborhood systems that we were told by DOR that existed. But to your point, there's not an on-site inspection that happens. So when we talk about revaluation, you're not talking about an actual on-site inspection as much as you're talking about. Is it just a double check? Is it a spot checking of different homes in a particular neighborhood or subdivision, or is it a spot check of the commercial facilities? How is that done in terms of the revaluation?
That's a, thank you. That's a common question that we have. We have property inspectors right now. They're out, hopefully today, inspecting properties, going door to door. They're measuring new constructions based on permits pulled. They're getting permits for every shape and form. They're getting when property owners want us to come out and look at their house for whatever reason, a leaking roof today. Our appraisers are out there. They're out there. If your physical data is not correct in your appraisal software system, which we're on the WinGap system, you're not going to have anything right. You're not going to have anything right. You're not going to generate a correct value if your physical data is not correct. So that's why we have your door-to-door inspections. We do it all in-house. Many counties subcontract that out to do property inspections, take photos of the properties, look at age, quality, construction, things of that nature. If that data is right, you're comparing your numbers to what's happening in the market. If the market is doing this, then you're adjusting your market up and down. Just like with the recession that we recently experienced, our digest fell 35% over a 5-year period. We follow the market. Whatever's happening right now will be reflected in the market next year. We've done annual revaluations since 2001. So I feel like we do a very good job on making sure all of our values are balanced according to what's going on in those respective markets. But we do rely on property owner information as well. When a property owner has an issue with a house, we want to know about it. We get all the fire reports. The gentleman here talked about disasters. We get monthly fire reports. We're going out to see what's going on with that house. We're make sure our values are reflecting what's out there in the world. So there are the values, what you were talking about, of whether it's every 3 years or whatever. That is simply based on what's happening in those local jurisdictions. Where you really get penalized for not having that is number one, if you fall below a 38 assessment ratio, then you could be subject to your public utility values, them not being assessed at a 40%. Rather, they would be assessed at whatever level you're at.
That's that sales ratio study that the Department of Audits does, right?
The sales ratio study is the analytics that says what's going on with that local jurisdiction. It says it is the lifeblood of whether you're treating people, number one, at the levels that properties are selling at, and if you're treating people uniformly and fairly. That's what that is. And so it is, there is a lot of meat to that.
Yes, Clint.
One thing that seems to come up, I know it comes up down here at the General Assembly, is lack of predictability. I think most people, if they know if their taxes are going up or down, or if they can plan for it, budget for it, they don't tend to get as upset as those that feel like they were surprised. I think a couple of years ago we had in the county that we're in right now some situations where people were claiming that they were having 100%, 200% increases in a single year. Well, that's obviously a dramatic shift and a very big hit to their budget to try to accommodate a doubling or potentially a tripling of your property tax bill from one year to the next. And I don't know of too many markets where you truly have that high of an inflationary increase in property values. Usually, if you're 5, 6, 7%, maybe 10%, but not 100%, not 200%. So what happened, I guess, is the question. Why did that jump occur? And a lot of the times it's because something went wrong in the past or over multiple years where assessments maybe were not kept up with. And then so finally you catch them up, but you catch them up and they take 10 years or 5 years or whatever it is worth of inflationary values, and they get it all in 1 year. But the problem is they didn't know it was coming that year. And so I think that's what really irritates people. So it may be the right value, it may be truly the market value, but it doesn't make it any easier to absorb into their budget. And so, if this committee could maybe look at what can be done to, again, help with that predictability so people don't have wild swings from one year to the next in valuation. So I think I think Chairman Welch, you may have mentioned this, but sort of maybe a smoothing approach over time, so you don't have any real significant jumps over a certain amount.
Do either of you know, if, going back to Judge O'Neill's question earlier, do you know of anything that deals with a hurricane situation where you've had such a dramatic, where you see such a dramatic change in the property values, and is there anything statutorily that guards against that in terms of the local government taking such a severe hit in terms of assessed values as a result of a natural disaster? I don't know of anything in our code that deals with that, so it would have to be under your general appraisal practices, I guess, if there's anything in that.
So there's, I guess, two issues. One is from the property owner's perspective, since we value as of January 1 every year, then if my home was destroyed 2 months ago, at the end of this year when my tax bill comes due, I'm still going to pay as of, what my house looked like January 1 of this year.
That's right.
So I may not have a house at all. I may be living, in an apartment somewhere, still paying, property taxes because that's what it was on January 1. I don't get a proration, right? I had my house for 6 months out of the 12-month period, so I get prorated for 6 months. I don't get that. And then from the local government standpoint, as you've already said, that the following year, that there will be a substantial change in those values, and that's where the cost shifting will occur, right? Because you're still going to cost you same amount of money to run that school system. You're just going to have to now shift the cost to everybody else that still has properties intact. They're going to have to pay more.
And if you have a property tax cap on your school system, and you're there or close to it,
Right.
man, I think that's where Judge O'Neill was saying, look,
Yeah.
there's not much you can do. So what statutorily is there that protects or guards against that? But you're having to balance interest. The property owner's right to a fair market valuation of the property versus the need to provide governmental services at what it costs. And I don't know. I can't conceive right now of a solution to that problem, but it's a valid question given what we're going through locally. Pat, did you have a question? I'm sorry.
If you're finished with that.
Yeah, sure.
We spent a lot of time in the Atlanta delegation trying to talk about some kind of a smoothing approach for the people who were facing unpredictably high increases. Do you have any examples of other states or other places where you tried to imagine, could it go up 10% and then it was 10% of what? I mean, how would the smoothing process practically work? And maybe you could find some examples for us. Because I think the shocker, people may agree that that's the real value, but their house hasn't been reevaluated correctly in a long time. So is there a way to make it, get them to fair value, but not in 1 year?
So you obviously would have to do something to amend our Constitution because you wouldn't be able to have a sort of a fair market value every year. But you could, I guess, have some sort of a situation where you revalue, say, every 3 years. I think that was mentioned already. And let's say over that 3-year period, the value goes up 30% from last time it was revalued. You could then let them absorb that 30% increase, not in that year, but give them over the course of the next 3 years. So between that period of time and the next time it gets valued, phase that in. So you take a 10%, 10%, or 10%, or it could be the other way around, right? It could also be a devaluation in value. So you'd have to, you could do it on a cycle, and then based on the amount of change over that 3-year cycle, you could then phase that in so they would know it was coming. Okay, I know that my value now has gone up X% since the last time, and I know that for the next so many years before I get revalued again, this is what my value's how it's gonna change. So that provides more predictability, maybe.
Yeah, go ahead. I know you touched on this before, like South Carolina, I think where they have a gradual increase and then a revaluation every 5 years, something like that.
Right, right. Well, the principle that Clint was talking, my name is James Robertson. I'm with the Georgia Association of Property Tax Professionals. And the process that Clint was speaking of is a process that is statewide in Maryland and has worked very, very well for 20, 25 years. And what he's talking about gives you the transparency that you're looking for, and it gives you the predictability you're looking for, because most taxpayers do look for those two things. And that takes that wild swing and spreads it out. Because the inherent problem that happens, I think, in looking at this process is that if you wait 6, 7 years like we've had, and you have that sticker shock, and it's a tremendous amount of sticker shock. Well, what that meant, though, was probably somebody else was carrying your burden.
Mhm.
You had a nice ride for about 5 years, but that catch-up really makes it difficult. So if you have a systematic process by which you take, just like Clint said, your value, let's just use the example of $1,000 to $3,000, or excuse me, $4,000. So there's a $3,000 increase over a 3-year period. And we chose 3 because that's what Maryland does. That's what we see as a short enough time frame by which you capture markets, because most markets don't go up 100% a year. You know, they're just not, people are not catching it. So then you phase in that increase, you know, one third, and then the third year it goes to the full value, and then you reappraise again, and you start that cycle. Then people have a predictability. They understand that this is what my assessment is this year. This is going to be over the next 2 years, and then we'll get to it, and we're going to do it again. And so then everybody's treated fairly. Now, what states do in other counties' jurisdictions, they divide their counties into thirds. Because what you have to, again, from a practical standpoint, and you're on the appraisal board, yes, sir?
Commissioner.
If you do a fee appraisal, it's $300 to $500. Do you know in Fulton County there's 350,000 parcels? That's $75 million. This is not fee appraisal. It's got to be
Who's
math.
got that contract?
So you have to have it politically feasible too, because it's an impossibility to do that. So they do mass appraisal, and they have to do mass appraisal, and by and large it works very well because your appeal percentages are usually fairly low. So the key, I think, in being in this industry, in this business, and being a homeowner is looking for that transparency and that predictability. And that type system that Clint is talking about is used in other states, and it works. Now, it requires a comprehensive change. And so that's, again, a suggestion. You have to understand exactly what you're trying to do and where you're trying to go. But I do think, can I make one other point?
Sure.
This concept of freezing values, this concept of 299C, I told you before, I've been doing this a very, very long time. That process was born out of, honestly, Fulton County in 1990 and 91 because it took them 3 and 4 years to get through their appeals. And what was happening was I would appeal my value, and then by law I had to file a return to get a notice the next year, that was the law, to file an appeal. It wasn't an automatic. And so what was happening was, by the time they got to my appeal 3 years later, let's say they reduced it 1 year, but then they were like, too bad you didn't file it for the next 2 years because you didn't know what you were doing. So 299C came in as a way to prevent that, to help the taxpayer, and that was fine. And during the economic downturn, 299C was fine. But what has happened now is that it's causing difficulty, especially among homeowners, because a lot of homeowners will come in and I see them and they're coming to get the lock. And that's great until the lock comes off and your value goes up 50%. And then, like the chairman said, it's really kind of difficult because only, what did we say, 10%? So some people get it and some people don't.
Right.
Well, if you do a 3-year cycle or whatever cycle you determine it to be, I think you have to be very careful. I think you can't, and I don't want to get off track here, but that gives everybody the right to have a 3-year freeze. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? It's not a pick and choose deal. Everybody gets that opportunity to have if you go to that type system, everybody, it's uniform, it's constitutional. everybody gets to have a 3-year lock. In theory, it may be phased in, and then that third year comes up, everybody gets another chance. That's why I say, from a practical standpoint, you would need to divide your county out to make it a practical approach. You can't practically, and here's where the other thing, things that work in Paulding County do not work in Fulton County. They just don't. There are 350,000 parcels in Fulton County. There are buildings in Fulton County that Paulding County will never see. I'm talking about in terms of scope, size, sphere. Same in Gwinnett. I live in Gwinnett. So every approach is not going to work, but there's some things that will work. And so those are the things like Clint touched on. I think that type of process will work from a transparency and a predictability standpoint, and in my opinion, a fairness standpoint.
Questions for James? I think that's, we had talked about it, and I heard you say that at the last meeting. And I think South Carolina was on a 5-year cycle, which is maybe too long. And then if you dovetail that into the other issue, and I'm going to wrap up, but if you dovetail that into the issue of ensuring that you're getting a true remarket evaluation periodically, under his scenario with Maryland, every 3 years. And then at that reevaluation process, since it is essentially locked in, if you will, for the next 3 years, if you have individuals who are properly trained to handle those appeals, because we got from the GAO a statement here that says 50 to 60% of the appeals they don't even show up for. So you have people filing appeals because they just have to in order to protect their rights, but then they figure it out. They talk to the assessor's office. They figure out it's not worth it, or they just don't show up because they birthday party or something. I don't know. But for whatever reason they don't show, that's a significant number of appeals that fall off the map. But those that are earnest in their appeals and will show up and pursue them, and then perhaps having someone that is sophisticated and neutral to review that and hear that petition might result in a more accurate and maybe a more fair process of letting the taxpayer feel like they had their day, and they weren't overshadowed by the assessor's office themselves. And I'm not trying to cast a bad light on the assessor's office. I'm just telling you the perspective that I hear from taxpayers and the ones that I see personally that they have that viewpoint. So that dovetails into what we were saying earlier. If you do that cycle and you have a team of hearing officers that may rotate throughout parts of the state on a 3-year or 4-year basis to do those hearings, and then providing more insight, more accessibility, if you will, to DOR or to the Department of Audits to just double check and look into the system and make sure that the systems are operating within that 38 to 40%. I guess it's an area of uniform accessibility. So those were just the things I think we're hearing that maybe we need to look at in terms of legislative adjustments. But any comments or feedback on what you've heard from these gentlemen and others that have spoken? What we'll do is we'll try to distill this with David and Brian, and I will try to distill this and put this into one document to give back out to the committee. And then we'll review them and decide what we would like to just put out as the committee's recommendation at our next meeting. And that will be our final meeting.
Chairman,
Yes.
can I just make a mention about the hurricane question, which was a very good question? I'm originally from the state of South Carolina, so Hugo came through years and years ago, and so that was a great point because it's the same process. What was there January 1? And I think that is kind of a nice thing that we have in Georgia, because if you go back to the economic collapse we had in 08 and 09, the sales tax revenue bottomed out. Thank God we have property taxes that's much more stable and takes a longer time to kind of generate, so it stabilized us out. I think that's what we saw back in the day in South Carolina. You may have had to have some sales tax issues created, maybe some additional sales tax, maybe some state revenue. Through QBE, you've already got that, the Quality Basic Education Act. So there's going to have to be a certain degree of revenue sharing at the state level, I think, to help Early County. Because constitutionally, if your house is gone, your house is gone, and there is a millage cap. So that the state is going to probably have to, and I think we're talking about that today, right? There's some part, the state's going to have to step in. There may be some, there'll have to be some assistance at the state level, because I don't think the local counties can absorb that at all.
Yeah, that is part of the discussions now. I don't know if that's in the bill. So.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, I want to thank you all for staying late this evening and hearing this out. And I appreciate everyone coming today. I hope this was a little bit, in a way, convenient for a lot more people since we're here this special extraordinary session. But I appreciate the input, and this will afford anyone else that has suggestions or comments can send those into our office, and we'll take those and put them together and assimilate them. Then I'll get those back out to you all, and we'll talk about it at a subsequent meeting. I think I'm going to try to schedule a meeting in the first or second week of December, and so I'll send out